Thank you, Rebecca, for that really interesting presentation. What a great start to our discussions, and putting the whole thing in context. And this next session, we'll be focusing on some of that. The next session is entitled Understanding Development and Recruitment, Fees, Remittances, and the Impact on the Global Economy. A starting position, perhaps, is that migrant workers remitted approximately $1 trillion to lower and middle income countries last year. And this session is going to examine the financial and social benefits that may accrue via migration for work. We're delighted to welcome
to the online panel,
Heather
State
Crawley,
of Play. Where are we?
Leads a number of initiatives at UN University, including more recently a big research project called Mylic. Hi, Heaven. Can you hear us fine? Excellent. We're just waiting for our third speaker. Okay, I'll continue. So it's easy when working with companies to view everything through a modern slavery lens. And that's been a basic premise of many companies, many initiatives to try to prevent modern slavery, and irregular recruitment and flawed recruitment practices have been presented in that way, that it's part and parcel of the modern slavery agenda. But that concentration perhaps fails to properly understand the many motivations that migrant workers have for seeking employment abroad, and the sort of inequity and the power imbalances which might compel them to do so. In this session, we want to unpack a little bit these things, and to pay a little more time looking at the flawed starting position for many migrant workers, and how that impacts on why and how they migrate. And we also hope that this session, building on what Rebecca has just said, begins to show the many benefits that migration for work brings to individuals, their families, communities, and countries of origin. However, equally important is that this doesn't get reduced solely to economics. There's much more to migration than that. Migrant workers can and do make enormous contributions to both countries of destination and origin, adding richness and diversity and culture to those societies where they are working, and then bringing home new skills, experiences, and ideas. Oh, I'm very pleased now that we've been joined by Michael Samras, who works for USAID. Hi, Michael. Can you hear us? Great, thank you. But to start off, Heaven. Thank you for joining us today. Heaven speaking to us from Italy today, joining us here in New York. But can you tell us about what you see as being the economic and non-economic benefits of labour migration, and what can or should be done to maximise the benefits of migration to development?
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for the warm welcome, and I'm very happy to join you here in Italy. I'm a migrant like many other of us, and I was really excited to get the invitation to come and talk to you about some of the work that we're doing on the relationships between migration and development at the UN University. And specifically, I'm going to talk about some of the evidence from this project called Mylic, which, Neil, you mentioned in your opening remarks. Mylic stands for the Migration, Development and Equality Hub. It's funded by the UK government through official development assistance, and it examines the relationship between migration, development, equality in the context of the global south, and very much with an eye to development and to delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's effectively one of the world's largest migration research projects, and over the last 12 countries undertaking research, engaging policymakers, engaging local communities, and also the private sector. And importantly, and Neil, again, you alluded to this in your opening remarks, we've been looking at both the sending countries from which migrants originate, but also the destination countries, because of course, migration has implications for both of those ends of the so-called corridor. Now, Mylic is more than just a research project. We have more than 30 impact interventions involving more than 120 local partners, and we work with 5 UN agencies, ILO, IOM, UNRWA, UN Human Rights, and my organization, the Centre for Policy Research, as well as the OECD Development Centre. So we're a huge resource. And what I want to do is to tell you a little bit about what our research tells us about what Rebecca was describing as the transformative potential of migration, not just for individuals and for households, and not just for businesses, but also for the broader development processes. And this, of course, is not just about the global north having its labour market needs, but also about the processes of transformation happening in the global south. So firstly, something about the contributions of remittances to development. Neil, you mentioned the figure of 1 trillion. I think it's very hard to know exactly the scale of remittances. We have lots of different estimates. I suspect we don't know the full extent because resources also transfer, even financial resources, through informal means. But we also, of course, have the benefits of the less economic aspects of migration that you mentioned. Certainly, we know that remittances constitute probably more than development assistance in terms of income into a country, or indeed foreign direct investment. I'm sure Michael will say more about that when we get to his presentation. I think it's very easy to get caught up in the figures, and I don't want to focus too much on those. I think even if we don't know exactly how big remittances are, we do know what the contribution of remittances can be. We know that it makes a very significant contribution to household income, and that is particularly true in rural areas. So around or over 50% of remittances are sent to poor households in rural areas, where 75% of the world's poor and food insecure are living. And what they send, migrants working abroad, can make up to 60% of the household's total income, which represents often a lifeline for millions of families and a source of constant income, even if their domestic situation changes. Our work, particularly in countries like Nepal, in Ethiopia, in Haiti, and in Egypt, has shown very clearly that those remittances make a very significant difference to people's quality of life. And those flows can reach people even when things go badly wrong. So in the context of a global pandemic, when everybody was expecting remittances to go down significantly, in fact, they didn't, in part because of digital transfers, which of course are measured in a more formal way. So globally, we expect that the accumulated flows of remittances to rural areas is going to increase. Say it's 1 trillion now, with something like $3 trillion over the next 5 years. And we know also from our research that these remittances have a significant impact in improving capital investments in housing and agriculture. And that sounds very abstract, but what it means is that people can put a roof on their houses, they can buy equipment to undertake their agricultural production. So very tangible, concrete benefits. It improves access to healthcare, particularly in contexts where healthcare is very limited. And it has huge implications for education. So our research from Burkina Faso, for example, has shown that children in migrant households stay in school much longer than children in non-migrant household. But as Neil said, it's not just about the financial contribution. Migrants also add to the diversity, richness and culture of societies, where they're bringing new ideas, skills and experience. And also culture, language, food. These are all things that we don't measure or quantify, which are so important to our everyday lives. But it's not just a positive story. I mean, it's very important to highlight the positives, but it's not just a positive story, unfortunately. We know that there are problems and issues with focusing on some of the benefits of migration, because those benefits of migration and of remittances come at a huge cost often to migrants and their families. And the first reason for that, and again, Rebecca alluded to this in her presentation, is the lack of safe and legal routes for migrants. So basically, there's a mismatch here between the needs of the labour market in many places for people, for migrant workers and for workers more generally, and the existence of bilateral and other labour agreements that make those movements possible. And if there isn't a regularly, and the costs of that journey both in terms of the financial costs, which can be considerable, but also the psychological costs are borne by the worker and his or her family. And that's a really important cost to consider. Secondly, even where there are legal routes, there are very significant recruitment fees. And I know you're going to be discussing that over the next few days. It can take a considerable time for people to pay back their loans. For example, our research looking at Bangladeshi migrants in Malaysia, people are taking up to 3 years to pay back the loans that they took to be able to have the employment in the first place. And that's a huge consequence for the kinds of benefits of migration that I was describing. Thirdly, we know that the conditions of migrant employment can often be very bad. This is because, in part, migrants are often very vulnerable, not necessarily because they're only irregularly in a country, but because they don't have the same language, they don't have the access to the trade unions. Wage theft, for example, is a very significant problem, and we're working with the Migrant Justice Institute really to look at how migrants can pursue their labour claims without losing their visa or even remain in the country of employment until they get their outstanding wages. If wages are the reason why people move and they're not being paid, then clearly that is a significant problem. The other issue that we've really noticed is the impact on children in migrant household. Children have agency and they adapt, they know the deal, they know that the migration is for the benefit of the household. However, there are clearly very significant impacts on children, particularly where parents are not often able to see their children. So just to conclude, what needs to happen to maximize the contribution of migration to development? Well, first of all, we need good working conditions for workers, and we need to address the issue of wage theft. People are moving for work in order to be able to enhance the potential of their family and the livelihoods of their family, then the fact that they're not getting the wages that were due to them or promised is clearly a significant problem. Secondly, no worker should pay for a job. The cost of recruitment should be borne by the employer, not the worker. And I know that's a very significant theme of your work, and I would very strongly encourage it to remain so because of the consequences for the workers. And thirdly, workers should be able to maintain relationships with their children. So although we have lots of mentions of family unity and the importance of the right to family unity, in truth, companies, businesses are benefiting from the fact that they don't have to pay for reproducing the social costs of the production of labour. We know that family unity has a very positive impact on worker productivity. It provides essential support for children. And I think the private sector needs to think very creatively about how to have family-friendly work environments for all employees, including those that have their family abroad, and allowing them time and the appropriate visa conditions to be able to continue to maintain that relationship with their children. And as employers, you can lobby your governments to allow that to happen. So just to conclude, we can't stop labour migration, and frankly, neither would we want to. It has huge benefits for migrants and their families, for businesses, and for the development process. However, we can very significantly improve the conditions under which labour migration takes place. It's absolutely within our gift to be able to do that, but that requires employers to behave ethically and not to treat their workers as units of labour and nothing else. And I would really urge you, with your powerful lobbying constituency, to ensure that states do what they need to do to create the condition whereby migrants can have their rights and also help to deliver benefits for themselves and their families and for the broader economy. Thank you very much.
Heaven, thank you for that. I think you've covered such a wide range of topics connected to this agenda there, and made us all contemplate the fact that it absolutely doesn't just come down to the economics of this. How much must migrant workers love their kids to spend 3 years away from them to pay for their education? You know, these are the decisions that migrant workers are making all of the time, and we need to consider that and our role in making that sacrifice easier and better for migrant workers. And like Heaven said, I think there's a big role for business in particular to play in that space. I'd like to welcome our other online panellists now. Michael Samras works for USAID. Michael, can you remind me where you're talking from today, please?
In Washington.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were in Central America. I do apologise. Sorry. So, Michael, the US government has a number of programs designed to add greater value to the overseas experience of migrant workers. So perhaps you can please describe the program that you've been working on and why you believe there are great benefits that can accrue to migrant workers and to countries of origin and destination through greater engagement and structure being added to migration for work, and not just, as Heaven said, a labour tap to turn off and on.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as many of you I'm sure are aware, USAID, we are a development agency. We're typically not involved in migration. We provide development assistance and humanitarian assistance around the globe. We typically defer on issues related to migration to our colleagues at the State Department and our Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. That said, it's something that we have started to work on in the past 4 years, and then significantly over the past 2 years under the Biden administration is working on circular migration, so seasonal migration from the Northern Central American countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And this is working with those governments, the ministries of labor in Honduras and Guatemala, and then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in El Salvador, to actually position those state entities as ethical recruiters that can go out into their municipalities, reach out through social media, and recruit their citizens that are interested in temporary work abroad opportunities. This is how we have to approach this, because understanding Northern Central America from our perspective, it is inextricably linked to the irregular migration that happens significantly from those three countries, as well as Mexico and others, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. So, we see these circular migration pathways as alternatives to that dangerous and, in some instances, detrimental irregular migration, because instead of these community members coming up on the dangerous journey north through Mexico, across the border regularly, and sending remittances back, yes, but not coming back to their community to share their human capital. Alternatively, we want to set up these or help foster these situations where year after year these workers can come from these countries, contribute to businesses in the U.S. and increasingly in Canada and Spain. And then we're also in discussions with New Zealand and potentially Australia to seasonally go to those countries and then return home, bring their wages, bring their skills back. And so we want to ensure that these workers are protected from, all the full circle, from the recruitment that happens, as Heaven said, all the recruitment costs should be borne by the employer. So we do trainings the ministries do trainings as they recruit to make sure that all interested people are aware. And, so we understand that a lot of people are going to be recruited through private recruiters. We want to make sure that they, even if they don't go through the ministries that we support, that they receive information from our work, USAID's work down there, just kind of is with the idea that no seasonal workers should be paying for their own visa, paying for their own transportation, that there are these lawful opportunities available to them, that they don't need a coyote and go through Mexico. And so beyond that, if the person is selected for a job abroad, then we train them on their rights while working abroad. This is for the U.S. This is based on the U.S. law that the Department of Labor enforces. Although we've also worked with different civil society organizations in the countries, as well as advocate organizations in the U.S. to give a more robust pre-departure know your rights training, as well as social support, so they understand, because many of these people are traveling abroad for the first time, have never been to the U.S. English is their second language often, so so they know what to expect. They know what is unacceptable when they are at the job sites in the U.S. or Canada and Spain. and crucially, how to report that. It could be with the Department of Labor, it could be with their own ministry. You know, the ministry that recruits them stays in touch with them while they are abroad, touching base with them. But it also could be with the different migrant and labor advocate organizations, some of which are participating in this conference and some of which are presenting in it. So we worked a lot with different organizations and done trips down to Central America to help strengthen the ministries' training of these visa holders to make sure that they're fully aware and equipped with the knowledge of how to report something. So USAID's role in this is the technical assistance to these ministries to position them as those ethical recruiters, but also on the policy side. As I mentioned, I'm in Washington, D.C., and a big part of what we do is trying to work with the interagency, the different parts of the U.S. government that do have a role in the visa, which USAID does not. You know, we do not have a natural role in this. So working with the State Department, with U.S. Customs and Immigration Services, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Labor, et cetera, just to make sure that the visas are, you know, equal access is given to them, figuring out ways to reduce the gender disparity because these visas, both the agricultural visas as well as the non-agricultural, are overwhelmingly men. And that's something that from a development standpoint, we are trying to counter to make sure that the benefits of them are more equitably distributed. So that's a big part of what we do. And then, you know, we are in the process of really bringing this full circle. And as these workers return to their country, either for several months before they return back abroad to work, or if they, you know, for whatever reason, they've decided not to go back or there is no job there anymore, we want to be able to train them, give them entrepreneurial training so that they can invest not just the income that they've gained while working abroad, but also their skills, you know, starting small businesses. You know, currently about half of the workers come back and they invest in housing, which is certainly a worthwhile investment that is, you know, certainly a durable good that lasts generation after generation in these Central American countries, particularly in the more far-flung, impoverished communities that a lot of these workers come from. But, you know, we want to start transitioning these return workers to starting small businesses and getting them more financially fluent, and so that they're able to take advantage of the whole suite of other work that USAID does, because about 99% of the work that USAID does in these three countries and globally is development work that's based on improving the lives of citizens in their countries where they are, you know, not working on circular migration. So once they return, we're looking at ways that we can link them up with, you know, the normal bread and butter, so to speak, of USAID's programs. So happy to take any questions later.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think that takes us somewhere interesting. It's about, does an initial migration prime the pump to further and greater development at home, or do we just see patterns of circular migration developing because progress isn't particularly made at home? And I'm going to explore that a little bit more with William in a minute. But William, first of all,
can I sit there?
Yeah, of course you can.
So I don't have my back facing anyone.
William, I'll shout at you across the room. William, I think first of all, can you just explain who Migrant Forum in Asia is? One of those organisations that's always at these meetings. It's always around this agenda, but maybe people don't quite understand who you are and what it is that Migrant Forum in Asia do. So first of all, can you just quickly explain the organisation?
I'm not sure if I also understand what I'm doing.
There you go.
But yeah, we are a regional network based in the Philippines. It's largely a very grassroots network that works across Asia and the Middle Eastern region, the Gulf region in particular, and then Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. And we largely look at what is called labor migration and in the low wage sector. So, and it's a lot of it is based, our network is made of 250 plus organizations, but engaged in different kinds of work from direct services to research and policy work, And the Secretariat tries to do a cross-learning between the different kinds of work we do within the network.
And you're helping migrant workers both at home and abroad.
Yes, exactly, across the corridor. So from country of origin to destination, that whole corridor kind of thing, we develop partnerships that accompany migrant workers, particularly when they find themselves in a situation of abuse or exploitation.
And you've listened to what Heaven and Michael have been saying, but what would you add in? What do you see are the key challenges facing migrant workers and their families, perhaps, at the moment? What are the things you're seeing?
Look, I've been reflecting on this for a long time, kind of thing as well, and particularly in this time of COVID and post-COVID, if you want to call it that. And to what Heaven said as well a little while ago, during the COVID, we raised a campaign, and IHRB is part of that campaign as well, on wage theft. And this was the first time that wage theft as a concept was used in the Asia region. We have never used this term. Again, it's also a reflection of our network, because when accompanying migrant workers, it was more from a service kind of perspective. So our members would take cases of migrant workers, accompany them through the system to see if they could get something back. But during COVID, the number of cases we received only pointed out to us something that was so obvious to us even before COVID, that in any given year, that is the biggest complaint that we get, money claims. That's the biggest complaint you get in any given year of migrant workers in any country of origin. And so when we raise this issue up, kind of thing, again, you realize, and this is where I think, listening even to this morning, we talk of power differential. We talk of transformative change. But I'm wondering if we need to start looking at this whole issue, not from I understand, and even in the Global Forum on Migration and Development, and the Global Compact on Migration and the UN system and things like that, a lot of it is looked at from the need for mobility, and because the market kind of needs it. And I'm wondering if we should start looking at it from the reverse side, from migrants, their communities, and from their eyes, with their eyes, start looking at what's happening, what it's doing to countries of origin, what is happening in the lives of migrants. And then when you look at words like transformation, then you realize that transformation is a long, long process in the lives of migrants. And even if they believe it, it can, like this, go away. We have seen this, for example, migrants who have so-called put a roof over their head, send the children to school, have access to health and things, and all it takes is one typhoon, and everything is wiped out. And where just a mother went earlier as a domestic worker, now because of what the typhoon wiped out, the mother and 2 other children or 3 other members of the family have to go out to recover what they had, where they had reached in so-called development. So that's a big kind of thing. When you talk of power differential, to look at migrants themselves and migrant workers themselves, countries of origin have created this facade of calling them heroes, our modern day heroes. But when you look at migrants, from the minute they leave their destination, their country of origin, even to be able to vote back for their own situations to change, they don't have that right anymore. In our region, only Philippines and Indonesia have voting rights for their nationals once they are abroad. No other country in our region has that. They don't get those kind of rights and enfranchisement in countries of destination. So they can't participate in processes of change. There is talk of them joining unions and things like that, but that is very rarely possible. And so when you want to talk of power differentials as well, to look at what powerlessness means to migrants, or to even experience or be in solidarity with that powerlessness, is something we have not fully explored or looked at, I think. And I think it's important that as we come out of this kind of situation of COVID kind of thing, when things really came to a stop, I think there's need to look at it from the other side, and not only from a our shelves are empty and we definitely need the agricultural worker. Like example now, a phenomena that is becoming big in the region, seasonal workers. Seasonal worker programs is something new in the Asia region. We've not had this before. At least prior to COVID, there was little talk of our workers going out as seasonal workers. Largely because the Asia migration story has been largely of temporary labor migration programs of 2-year contracts. And we used to say temporary permanent cycle. But now there's this new phenomenon of seasonal workers that is coming up. And the damage that it is doing, largely to our communities, in the way that the pretension that there's going to be a big uptake of workers, and there's going to be good money in this. In a very short time, you make what you can. And so workers have started signing up to these programs. We've got one corridor, for example, South Korea now, where local governments, so we've been talking at the global level, we've been talking about local governance, local mayor mechanisms and stuff like that. And now in South Korea, between South Korea and Philippines and South Korea and Nepal, we've just as Migrant Forum Asia exposed how local government in Korea is talking to local government in the Philippines. Workers are going across without the national government knowing. And so when we brought it out in a webinar kind of thing, local government was concerned because they realized that they were involved in a crime-like syndicate now. So this is a new thing that has emerged on cyber hiring. We've all looked at, and we were looking at this whole kind of farms that they call them farms, set up in Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and things like that. Big numbers of workers brought in for cyber marketing, from cryptocurrencies to sex trade kind of thing. And it was just last week that 1,000 workers in a raid were found in the Philippines. 1,000 workers, and within the ASEAN, and these workers were largely from the ASEAN region. So there is no requirement of recruitment within the ASEAN region. Workers can come into the Philippines or move around the ASEAN without visas. So that possibility of moving within the ASEAN has been taken advantage of to circumvent the whole recruitment process. And suddenly you find 1,000 workers in a place in Clark where they are all being exploited. The situation was, and it took one Indonesian worker to call his embassy and say, this is happening, we haven't been given our wages and things like that. And then the trafficking, the kind of police unit went to do a raid, and they found 5 to 7 different nationalities in that one compound, one place. And that's 1,000 workers. And we have no idea of how many more compounds or buildings are there like that. So I think the need, therefore, again, to look at this pressure that is building is, while we look at it from the north as markets and need for mobility and things, stability for life in the north, the impact of life in the south is further eroding whatever development is possible. And I think it's time, if we are going to look at this collaboration, what Evan talks about, what Rebecca talked about, that collaboration has to be real for the South as well.
I think that's a really important point. And so Michael, in his remarks, he talked about the benefits and trying to maximise the benefits of returning migrants. But you and I have talked about how the ability to go abroad and work abroad can tend to distort local labour markets, with workers perhaps being unmotivated to work for the lower wages that they can acquire in countries of origin.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the story a long time ago with the workers that were in the Korea-Asia corridor, South Korea-Asia corridor. We are seeing it now within the Europe kind of corridor with Asia. Largely because you think under the seasonal worker program or under the Korea exchange kind of program, because workers assume they are going to earn a lot in the destination country, they no longer, there is such a huge stockpile at the moment, of workers waiting to go to Korea. They have passed the language test and everything, but because the quotas have been filled or the quotas are limited, you have them waiting. And because they are waiting, they don't necessarily take on jobs at home. They remain idle. Or if they have gone on these programs, when they come back, because there's no technology transfer or something like that between these countries. So when they come back, they worked on a farm somewhere in Europe, they come back and now they wait for the next cycle. They are not bringing back technology or knowledge that they can now use productively and start up something at home. So that idleness is creating, again, it's having a development impact on countries of origin. It's actually slowing down the development of countries of origin.
So Heaven, I was in Nepal recently, and we talked to Mylic researchers and a number of other NGOs working there, and they told us regularly of the reluctance of would-be migrants to attend skills training and pre-orientation classes, and this was particularly the pattern for first-time and younger migrants who, when they get to countries of destination, realise that having skills would actually allow them to access the better paying jobs and roles abroad. But is there anything that might be done to prepare people better for working abroad? Or are we always going to be up against the seductive promises of recruiters about well-paid jobs that we all know bear little relation to the realities when these workers get abroad?
Well, it's a complicated question, so I'm going to give you a complicated answer. And I'm going to complicate it in 3 different ways. First of all, I think it's important to, remember that when we're talking about the seduction of migration abroad, we also have to compare that with the possibilities and realities of life where people are, right? So people are not just, there's a very populist narrative around people being somehow greedy. No, this is people often from rural areas who then often migrate to cities, find that they're in competition there and can't make a good living and a livelihood. So this is about how, given the limited opportunities available to me, do I maximize on my human capacity, essentially, because that's the most important thing that people have. So I think it's, going back to William's point, I think it's really important to see this from the perspective of migrants rather than talking about it in a kind of an abstract labour market way. People do balance up the opportunities available to them, and often there are few opportunities potentially that they can take advantage of. I think the second thing is to be, and it kind of relates in a way, is to be cautious about narratives. Most migration in the world doesn't happen from south to north. About 1/3 of migration happens from south to north. About 1/3 happens between the countries of the global north, and about 1/3 happens between the countries of the global south, who have much bigger populations to begin with. So this is about differences in economic opportunities between the countries of the south, as well as between the south and the north. And within Mylic, and you've spent time in Nepal, so you'll have heard about this. A country like Nepal has people not just traveling to Malaysia, which is where we're doing our research, but to to the Arab states, to different parts where people feel there are opportunities and where there are, particularly where there are bilateral labour agreements which make that possible. So the narratives of this tend to flatten out the whole story, and they ignore, I think, the differences between countries and between migrants. There's been mentioned, for example, I think, Michael, you mentioned gender issues. I think there are real gender issues that we need to take account of this and not, again, flatten out the experiences of migrants, because how we provide opportunities for people within their countries of origin is going to be different potentially for men and women. Migration can reduce inequalities, including gender inequalities, but it can also increase them. So it's about really understanding the nuances in terms of country, in terms of different groups of migrants, and also, as Rebecca said, trying to sort of address this issue of narrative, not just from a broad perspective, but also, as William alluded to, not just reinforcing. We want to be positive about migration, and in so doing, there's a danger that we just talk all the time about, migrants as heroes and the positive aspects. But it interconnects migration with so many different facets of society and facets of life, which is really my third point, which is one of the main problems about migration research and migration policy is it disconnects migration from these broader processes. So if we want to understand how to really harness the benefits of migration, we have to situate it within context, context of urbanization, context of circular migration, context of development more generally, and context of inequality, because there are huge inequalities in the right to move and huge inequalities in the opportunities that people can access. So yeah, I'm sorry to further complicate the scenario, but in truth, there are hugely complicated dimensions to this, and it would really help on all sides of this picture if we could really get into some of the nuance, because I think that ultimately will help us to deliver better policy responses.
Thank you, Heaven. And we never anticipated that this would be an easy and straightforward discussion. It's a very complicated and many-faceted issue. Michael, I know that you have to leave us early today, but I just wonder if you'd like to respond to that. And are there any, maybe talk about some of the positives that you've seen in the work that you've been doing with USAID in the communities that you're working in. I mean, is there an upside to this? What are the upsides that you're seeing?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's really important to understand the migratory context in Northern Central America. These are countries that are beset with citizen security issues, with high levels of corruption. They are just, hit by the impacts of climate change, be them hurricanes, drought, et cetera. So there are a lot of reasons why these people, want to leave these countries and migrate irregularly. They don't have the opportunity to, some do have the opportunity to leave the country and, primarily go to the US with an actual visa, live there, reunite with their families. That said, the vast majority do not. So, it has been evidenced month after month over the past, generations that these people are going to travel north, regardless. So what we're just trying to do, instead of the hundreds of thousands of citizens that have traveled north irregularly, we're just trying to open up these small opportunities small opportunities for them to migrate regularly and seasonally, so that they're able to return year after year, and then again bring back the benefits. I've lived in El Salvador, and it was obvious. It was a very impoverished community, and the only houses with roofs, the only houses with concrete floors were those that had a relative in the U.S., and 100% of those relatives had been were undocumented in the U.S. Sending remittances back. Some had been there for years, some decades, but they, their children, their grandchildren, all pretty much understood that they were not going to come back. Their wives were left, or their husbands were left, and they understood that they had already started new lives in, New Jersey and Texas, wherever they ended up. And so this is kind of a counter to that they can return year after year, and with the assistance of USAID and their own governments, again, try to direct these into areas that really need it. The dry corridor of Honduras and Guatemala, which, are hit by these impacts of climate change, these indigenous communities as well that have lacked economic opportunities for, forever. And, directing that change for the maximum benefit of these communities, is a way that with just the small investment from USAID that, these relationships once established between the employers abroad and not just the individual workers, the communities that they come from, so that it can grow year after year and, establish a precedent that, yes, it's good to go abroad, but do it in a regular way. And then you can bring back, yourselves, your skill, your knowledge, your incomes, and just, so we're just trying to find a way to channel that obviously, the demand to migrate is there, and there's nothing, the push and the pull factors. Sorry. There's some static here, but the push and the pull factors are, something that USAID is never going to overcome, and no government to overcome. So we're just trying to, do what we can with what we have.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I think that something that we were talking about earlier was around political disenfranchisement of migrant workers working abroad. The fact that, whole economies, the economy of Nepal, is founded on the wages of migrant workers, and many other countries as well, with migrant workers adding significant amounts of money to their economies back home through remittances. And yet, ironically, these migrant workers, the ones who are earning this capital, this GDP for their countries of origin, are effectively disenfranchised because they're unable to vote abroad. And William, I just wonder if you've got any sort of thoughts on how that might be addressed.
Yeah, look, we've been advocating for rights of migrant workers even when they go abroad to be able to participate, because like we said, you just heard that the push and pull factors kind of things. So if migrants leave, and many leave because of poverty, then how do they participate in bringing change kind of thing back home? But it gets very complicated. You take Nepal, for example, and that's why I like what Evan says as well. I think you've got to really get down to context and look at what is the dynamic within that context that can lead to transformative change. I'll give you this example with this question of Nepal. In Nepal, for example, the politics is of an elite class that is there. Nepal is, even though constitutionally and it says that the caste system is no longer in existence, a lot of the migrant workers who do migrate are from the Terai region kind of thing and of low caste. Why would they be given the chance to participate in political change in the country? So how do you change that? How do you change that? Sri Lanka, which is a country that was torn by war for so many years between the Tamil and the Sinhala kind of communities, a large part of the Tamil community being overseas and working overseas, that would love to maybe come back home, maybe. But then why would you change that political dynamic in that country? India, big country like India as well, where there was a study that was made to say technology-wise, it is easy to do, to give workers the right to vote even if they are overseas. But why change that? Why change the political structure of a country when the poor who have to survive have left the country? Why would you give them power over the political elite that is existing in the country? So these are a lot of kind of dynamics within the country that you've got to kind of get down to kind of thing. Then in countries of origin as well, take freedom of association. Which country actually allows, in the true sense, freedom of association? Now with so much of pressure, you say yes to freedom of association, trade unions for migrant workers. But there are still labor unions that have constitutions that say that migrants cannot be part of the leadership of the trade union. So what's the point if you can't be part of the leadership of the trade union? It's just for the fees paying, dues paying kind of trade union. So you look at that powerlessness all along that line, and that's why it's not only about voting rights, it's about how we visualize, how we realize what empowerment means for migrant workers. And of course, I fully agree with Evan to say that you can't generalize it. There are so many intersectionalities involved in this. And then, of course, there is the gender dimension of it as well. So when you start unpacking it, there's so much to unpack to understand what transformation would look like in this context.
And so very clearly, not just economic, but as Heaven said, it's about the inequitability of the starting position, the inequity of the starting position that prevents real sort of change. I'm going to now turn to our question moderator and ask Bonnie Have we had any good questions coming in from our online and in-person audience?
Yes, definitely. Hi, everyone. We need to do this. I need to be the Grand Central Station for question monitoring because we're actually tracking questions in real time from 3 different sources. You in the room, online, live streaming, and also with our online participants. So please help us by writing them out, and we will do the best we can to get as many questions in as possible. We also need to do a hard stop. So I'll just give you the first bunch of 3, and you can see, and then if we have time, we can go to the next 3. So the first one is on the psycho and social cost of labor migration. I think this was in large part in response to Heaven's point when she raised that we shouldn't only just look at numbers, but look at the social cost. And this is in response to Neil's point about how much do you love your kids to leave them for 3 years as you embark on a job abroad. We have another question that William also spoke about briefly. What is this future of AI, in recruitment? It's certainly a very topical issue right now in the news. And the third question is asking about how can we better design labor agreements so that seasonal hiring can be improved, particularly in countries of destination. What kind of commitments and how can we design these commitments so that there can be resources devoted to upskilling the migrant workers in the country of origin. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie. Heaven, perhaps you'd like to come in with the first of those. How do you see this?
I'll take a couple of the questions, if I may. On the psychological and social costs of migration, I mean, there are also benefits, and I'm not trying to sort of say that it's all bad. We have to really beware of, well, we've got a fine line to tread, right, between the migrant as victim and the migrant as hero. And it's somewhere, in all honesty, between the two, and it often is both at the same time. So, I mean, I think the psychological and social costs of migration are greatly increased where people firstly have to move irregularly and remain in a regular position in the places that they move to. And secondly, where there are negative migration narratives that politicize the lives of migrants and can lead to racism, xenophobia, and real consequences, both in the country where people move to, but also in the consequences where people move from. There can be stigma, for example, for migrant children who have there's a kind of an abandonment narrative. And of course, migration is part of a household strategy. Parents do not abandon their children, but they understand that there are costs and consequences. So I think this issue of narratives needs to be addressed, and I think safe and legal routes would reduce the social and psychological costs because it more of a kind of supportive, the apparatus for a more supportive response to migrants and their families. On seasonal or circular migration, and Michael also talked about this, one of the problems we have is this mismatch that Rebecca highlighted in the beginning of today between the needs of labour markets all over the world and the ability of people to move to be able to fulfill them in some way. People are being trapped, essentially, because people's propensity towards circular migration, towards being able to return home and then move again and then come back, which happens at a local and a national level, but also potentially happen internationally, is being stopped because people are not prepared to open up safe and legal routes. So we come back partly to that. So it's about recognizing that actually 96.4% of the world's population doesn't move. The vast majority stay within their countries of origin. And those that do move, if they could, would often prefer to return or to be able to return and go back. So part of it is a shift into understanding what migration is about and the motivating factors that underpin it. And also recognizing that it's not only the poor that move. In fact, the least poor don't move. They can't move. They don't have the social or financial capital to do so. So it's often the people who are more educated or at least have some education and who have a kind of aspiration to do better in the world. All of these things we could be dealing with much better to everybody's benefits. But because we're locked often in a negative migration narrative, at least as far as some of the poorest in the world are concerned, I mean, I don't mean the absolute poorest, I mean the relative poorest, because many other people can move, then I think we're going to have a bit of a struggle. I'll leave William to deal with the AI question, but I do think it's a real threat on the horizon potentially, because it takes, as has been alluded to already, people out of any kind of formal structures whatsoever. But I'll hand over to William for the proper response.
William, before you astound us all with your technological know-how, perhaps you might like to also consider the other part of one of the questions, which was about what would your solution be for this to address some of this temporary labour migration that we're starting to see. You know, I mean, you talked about Nepal earlier, and where workers are being recruited on 20-week contracts. How can the economics of that ever possibly work for a worker to go from Nepal to Great Britain to work on a farm, possibly on low hours, not guaranteed enough hours to pay for that recruitment, and that's with the worker paying the recruitment, let alone with the farm paying the recruitment.
Look, I think if we were looking for migration to be a transformative experience for all, and I'm going away from the win-win-win kind of solution kind of thing, but really to look at transformative solution for all. MFA started in the 1990s by looking at first reintegration. And we needed to look at reintegration only because within the entire Asia region, the model that we have was of labor migration. Not like in other parts of the world where you have immigration tied to movement. In our part of the world, with the bulk of migrants going to the Gulf countries, we have been conditioned to look at labor mobility in terms of labor migration. And so MFA started with a program called in the 1990s MFA started with thinking of 6 visionary women who thought of putting Migrant Forum Asia together and looked at reintegration program for domestic workers at that time from Hong Kong. And the program was called Migrants Savings for Alternative Investments. And it was alternative because it had to move away from the models that we have of consumption and to look at something more sustainable as an investment program at the community level that migrants could be part of. That was the way MFA looked at reintegration in the early 1990s. I don't think today within migration discourse we look at reintegration in the way we need to look at it as partners. Countries of destination have nothing to do with reintegration. At least that is what they think. But if countries of destination started also looking at what reintegration means in a transformative perspective, maybe we might have a way of looking at labor migration from a more holistic and human-centered approach. The other thing we are only beginning to look at, and my fear is we might be going in the wrong direction, is access to justice. And I think if we started focusing on access to justice as what I'm saying I'm worried about is that more and more it's looking like a private sector initiative. But working with migrants, our experience is that the first recourse is to government, whether it is a mission, the country of the embassy, or getting in touch with a family member back home to inform them that the recruiter cheated me, make a complaint to the Ministry of Labor. So to get this access to justice right, I think would be that missing kind of portion of the empowering dynamic. Once migrants know that there is this possibility, I think we would see there could be some changes within this. So I think there are 2 dimensions we are only beginning to start looking at now. One is access to justice, which is for now taking more, and we've seen this in the wage theft campaign, it's taking more a private sector lane kind of thing. The governments have still not come fully on board kind of thing. So there needs to be more of that. And the whole question of participation of countries of destination in reintegration, particularly as more and more the programs are becoming short-term, like seasonal worker programs and things like that is on the rise, and single-person migration and not family migration and things like that. So I think reintegration would be something to look at. As far as AI is concerned, I have zero knowledge on this. But I would say this. Migrants trust so much that face-to-face thing. I've seen the growth of apps like crazy. Every company wants to put out an app. You know, every donor wants to come to us and says, "What do you think about this app?" You know, and so it's like apps was the thing, and now it's AI, and we've got to be very careful. Because we know when we started the migrant recruitment advisory some years ago, you know, at the end of the day, it was offline. Migrants wanted to talk to somebody. They don't want to fill up and form on an app and things like that. So I know that's a very dangerous. I don't know. Maybe in time, maybe like.
I think that we've seen this, and who remembers blockchain? 3 years ago, we were all talking about blockchain. That was going to solve everything.
Exactly.
And you know, so we see this across the board, and I think that these things, all of these technological solutions get proposed, are simply ways that encourage people to stand out and lean out from the discussion when they should be leaning in. I think that that's the point that you're making. Thank you very much, Heaven, Michael, who's left us. Heaven, thank you very much for joining. Please go back to enjoying Italy.
Thank you for the invitation, and I hope you have a great event.
Thank you very much, and thank you, William Good. Thank you all.